Before the flood came, before the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, something else happened. Something the Bible mentions in only a few verses and then goes silent. 6 verses. That is all we are given. 6 verses to describe an event so strange, so unsettling, that ancient scholars debated it for centuries, and modern readers skip past it without asking the one question that matters. What were the Nephilim? And why did God feel the need to destroy almost everything he had made, not long after they appeared? This is not a story about an ark, not yet. This is the story of what came before it, the story the flood was sent to erase. Somewhere in the earliest pages of Genesis, hidden between the genealogies and the begats, there is a fracture, a moment where the text shifts tone, where something happens that the writer almost seems reluctant to explain. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And their children were the Nephilim, the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Renowned, mighty, old, 3 words, and then silence. What kind of beings were called sons of God? What did it mean for them to come down? And why, immediately after their arrival, does the text tell us that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually? Something happened, something the ancient world remembered with dread, and the modern world has mostly forgotten. Picture the earth before the flood. Not the world you imagine when you picture ancient history, not simple tents and quiet fields. Picture something older, something stranger. A world where the line between heaven and earth had not yet fully closed, where the sky did not feel so far away, where men still remembered walking with God in a garden, and grief for that garden had not yet faded into myth. Generations had passed since Eden. Cain had killed Abel. Seth had been born to replace the son that was lost. And along 2 divided bloodlines, humanity multiplied across the earth, the line of Cain, restless and inventive, building cities and forging metal, composing the first songs of violence and pride. And the line of Seth, quieter, calling on the name of the Lord, watching, waiting, trying to remember what had been broken. For a while, the 2 lines stayed apart, but things that are divided do not always stay divided. Then comes the moment the text almost whispers. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, not admired from a distance. Saw, the way something ancient sees something it wants. And what they wanted, they took. Stop here for a moment, because this line is heavier than it first appears. This is not a poetic phrase about beautiful women and admiring men. In every other place, this exact phrase appears in the Hebrew scriptures, sons of God. It refers to divine beings, angels, members of the heavenly court, not human kings, not human nobility. Something else, something that did not belong on the earth and chose to come down anyway. Imagine that for a moment, not human desire crossing a social boundary. Something transcendent, crossing a boundary it was never meant to cross. Beings who had stood in the presence of glory, who had seen things no mortal eye could survive, looking down at the earth and wanting what was not theirs. And what was born from that transgression were the Nephilim. The word itself is unsettling, Nephilim. Some translate it as the fallen ones, others as the ones who cause others to fall. Either meaning carries the same weight. These were not simply large men, not warlords, not myths of exaggerated memory. The text calls them mighty men of old, men of renown, but renown is a strange word to use so early in human history, when there had barely been enough time for legends to form. Renown, this early, suggests something extraordinary had already happened, something that could not be forgotten, even by a world that would soon be erased. Ancient traditions outside the Bible remembered them as giants, beings of terrifying size and strength, whose violence spread faster than crops could grow, whose hunger physical and something deeper than physical could not be satisfied. Some ancient texts describe them consuming everything around them and still starving. Some describe them turning against humanity itself and eventually against each other. Whatever they were, their presence marked a turning point. Because right after their appearance, Scripture tells us something devastating. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, not occasionally evil, not evil in certain seasons, only evil. Continually, something had corrupted the world at its root. Try to imagine living in that world. Imagine watching the sky differently than we do now, not with wonder, but with a low, constant unease. Imagine parents warning their children not to wander too far after dusk. Imagine hearing stories, whispered around fires, about beings who were not quite human and not quite divine, who walked among the tribes of the earth and left devastation behind them, not gods to be worshipped, not angels to be trusted, something in between and something wrong. Imagine the quiet terror of realizing that the created order itself had been breached, that the wall between what was above and what was below had cracked, and something had slipped through it. This is the world Noah was born into. Not a peaceful world, waiting patiently for judgment. A world already unraveling. A world where violence filled the earth, where corruption had become normal, where the boundary between human and something other than human had blurred so completely that Scripture says, God saw that the earth was corrupt, and that all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. All flesh, not just some men, not just a few nations, all flesh. Some ancient interpreters believed this corruption was not only moral, but something closer to biological. That the boundary crossed by the sons of God had begun to unmake the created order itself, blending what should never have been blended, distorting bloodlines, twisting the image of God in man into something else entirely. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the message is the same. Something sacred had been violated, and the world was breaking because of it. And in the middle of all of that unraveling, we are given one line that changes everything. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Grace. In a world where grace should have been impossible to find. Some traditions suggest that Noah's importance was not only about his righteousness, but about his lineage, that in a world where corruption had spread through nearly every family line, Noah remained perfect in his generations, untouched, unmixed. A single thread of what humanity was meant to be, preserved in a world that had lost almost everything else. Think about the weight that must have carried, to be the last uncorrupted thread in a fabric that had almost completely unraveled. To walk through a world where giants ruled, where violence was law, where the average person had likely never known anything but fear, and to remain faithful anyway. This is not a children's story about animals boarding a boat 2 by 2. This is the story of the last righteous man on earth, watching everything around him collapse into darkness, and being told by God that it was time to build something that could survive what was coming. Time to preserve what little remained of what humanity was supposed to be. And what was coming was not simply a flood. It was an undoing, a reversal of creation itself. The same waters that had been separated on the second day of creation, the waters above and the waters below, were now being allowed to collide again. The world was returning, in judgment, to the formless chaos it had been pulled from at the very beginning. This is the turning point. Not simply rain falling from the sky, but heaven and earth colliding in judgment against a world that had crossed a boundary it should never have crossed. For 40 days, the waters rose, every mountain, every high place where men might have believed themselves safe from what was happening below. Every trace of the corruption that had spread across the earth was swept beneath the waves. The giants, the wickedness, the mingling of what should never have been mingled, gone. Except it wasn't entirely gone, because Genesis, later, gives us a strange and haunting detail. After the flood, When Israel's spies enter the land of Canaan generations later, they report seeing the sons of Anak described using the same word, Nephilim, giants, again, in a land the Israelites were told to conquer. However you interpret that detail, the message beneath it is unmistakable. Some things do not fully disappear just because judgment has come. Some corruptions echo forward. Some battles are never entirely finished in a single generation. So, what does this story actually mean? Why does it matter, thousands of years later, to someone watching this in the modern world? Because underneath the strangeness of giants and fallen beings, this story is about something achingly human. It's about boundaries, about what happens when created things reach for what was never meant to be theirs. About how corruption doesn't usually announce itself loudly, it creeps in slowly, generation by generation, decision by decision, until an entire world can look around one day and realize that every inclination of the heart has quietly become evil. It's also a story about remaining faithful in a world that has lost its way. Noah did not have the luxury of community. He did not have anyone around him who shared his conviction. Scripture doesn't tell us of Noah having crowds of followers or a movement of like-minded believers standing beside him. It tells us of one man and his household standing nearly alone against the moral collapse of an entire age. Maybe that is the real weight of this story. Not the giants, not the flood, but the loneliness of righteousness in a world that has stopped valuing it. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the quiet pressure to blend in with what surrounds you, to let boundaries blur, just slightly, because everyone else has already let theirs blur completely. To tell yourself that a small compromise here, a small corruption there, is nothing compared to what everyone else is doing. That is exactly how the world before the flood was lost. Not all at once, not through a single dramatic collapse, but through generations of small crossings, small mixings, small departures from what was meant to remain separate and sacred until an entire civilization woke up one day, fully corrupted, without remembering how it had gotten there. The Nephilim were not simply monsters from an ancient myth. They were the result of a boundary broken and never repaired. A warning frozen in scripture, half-explained, deliberately unclear, as if the writer wanted future generations to feel the discomfort of the unknown rather than the comfort of a fully resolved explanation. Some mysteries are left open on purpose, not because we are meant to solve them completely, but because we are meant to sit with them, to feel in that discomfort, a warning about what happens when the created order is treated as something flexible instead of something sacred. And maybe that discomfort is exactly the point, because we live, now, in another world where boundaries feel increasingly optional, where the line between right and wrong is treated as a matter of personal preference rather than a fixed reality. Where corruption rarely arrives with the drama of giants walking the earth, it arrives quietly, gradually, one rationalized decision at a time. The question this story leaves behind is not really about who the sons of God were, or how tall the Nephilim stood, or which mountain range Noah's Ark eventually rested on. The real question is far more uncomfortable than that. If you were living in that world, if you watched the boundaries around you dissolve one by one, if you watched almost everyone accept what should never have been accepted, would you have been able to remain, like Noah, one uncorrupted thread in an unraveling world? Would you have noticed the corruption at all? Or would you have called it normal, the way an entire civilization once did, right up until the rain began to fall? The flood did not come without warning. It came after generations of silence, generations of small crossings, generations of a world slowly forgetting what it meant to be human, separate, and sacred. Somewhere, right now, that same quiet unraveling might be happening again, not with giants in the land, but with the same ancient pattern, the slow surrender of what should never be surrendered. The waters rose once before, and history has a way of remembering the shape of the things it has already destroyed.